guys, here come the dollies. They got fresh sinkers, hot coffee, and the sweetest smile.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Clubmobile. We're very happy to have you.
The first time you was actually seeing us do
Yes,
this. Very
this is the
strange.
first time you guys are getting to see us, put some
Yeah.
faces to the names. This is a very special episode. We're very honored to be joined by Susan Tate and Kenny, author of American Fly Girl, which is the story of Hazel Ying Lee. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
I have to say, just off the cuff, this book had me on tenterhooks the entire time I was reading it.
Me too.
I felt almost like by the time I got to the end, first of all, I felt like by the time I got to the end, I felt like Hazel was my friend.
Yeah.
I wish I knew more of her, or she had lived a longer life, because she just seemed to have had such an infectious personality.
Yes, I loved her.
And I feel like as well, even though we knew the end result was coming, we were still so invested, not in like a just in case something changed type of deal, but we were so sucked in that I found myself forgetting what was about to happen.
Yes.
And when it did happen, I was crying. Just
Yeah.
Oh my God. I knew it was gonna happen because we'd already researched. But yeah, I was completely invested the whole entire time. I loved it.
Oh. Yeah, very, very sad part of her
Very,
life
very sad.
It
Yeah,
was
incredibly sad.
she made in just a few short years. So
Yeah.
That's, I mean, a fraction of a life. She was,
Mhm.
but her life, I think, was just powerful. The
Yes.
impression that she left, even in that short amount of time.
Mhm.
What was it about Hazel in particular? Of all the WASPs, there were so many of these women. What was it about Hazel in particular that made you want to dig deeper into her story?
No.
Her strength and determination struck me right from the beginning. The fact that she was a person of ethnicity, a Chinese American, and at that time, the only Chinese American or any ethnicity in the WASP program, what she had to do and the hurdles she had to overcome to get there were very different than the other Euro American girls who were in the program. So I was struck by that, and that she had this tremendous desire to serve her country. She was Chinese American. She was born here, but of course her parents were Chinese, and just from the beginning, her strength and determination, they still inspire me every single day. How she just broke through barriers in a very peaceful and honestly comical way. She could use her sense of humor to make people's lives happier.
It was very funny. From reading your book, I think, like Gabby just said, her personality was so infectious, and you could sort of feel how comedic she was. Did you ever have the opportunity to speak with people that did fly with her for the book, or was it completely independent research?
I was able to watch many interviews of people who knew her, family members who and WASPs who are no longer living, but were interviewed obviously while they were still alive, and they spoke of Hazel. And everybody is the same, gets a big smile on their face when they started talking about her and the influence she had on their life. What an enormous influence she was, both as a Chinese American and as a woman, in just being the only woman like herself in this WASP program. So she was alone, and most people had never met a Chinese American before.
Yeah, I remember reading that as well, was that not that she was, I mean, she was a Marvel just as herself, but a lot of them wrote home, didn't they? And said that they had never met a Chinese American, and she would take them out for Chinese food. And couldn't she drink? Like, she just drank and drank and drank. She used to drink like a horse.
Yes, she did.
I love that.
She introduced many of them to Chinese food. They'd never had it, and she
Mm,
ordered in Cantonese. And the women said she ordered in rapid fire Cantonese, and they, of course, were amazed and also amazed at how much she could eat. And she said, if you get full, just drink more tea, and then you can eat more.
yes.
I loved that. I loved that. I love that they adopted calling her Ying
Mm.
instead of calling her Hazel, which was her American name. It just, to me, it just kind of left this impression that they loved her for who she was. She didn't have to be like, ashamed of being Chinese, or that she really was free to be herself. And I almost you could picture it like when you wrote that she would come into their barracks and she'd go, "What's what?" You could
Yeah,
almost see her kind of swinging the door open and just like, "Hey, what's going on in here?" She really does become a friend as
she
you're
does,
reading it.
and almost like a family member, which I
Yeah,
what her family called her. And one of the women in a snippet I read about Hazel said, "Well, anybody in that time could be called Hazel, but there was only one Ah Ying, and that's how unique she was to them."
that's it's amazing.
Yeah,
I love that she was so unique to them amongst the number of siblings she had at home. Because I
right.
know that there was
Yes.
a lot of them crammed into that tiny apartment at one point. And
There
even
were,
when she moved to China
yes,
Oh
to
and
fly
yeah.
she
there.
kind of in the middle of the mix. Yeah. Yeah, big family, very small apartment in Portland, Oregon's Chinatown. And then in China too, they lived the same way,
Mhm.
it's around China. Yeah, and she still came out, emerged with this very unique personality. I mean, she was like herself right from the beginning.
Absolutely. I also really loved I think it's in the first section of the book where you describe her as a young child and she's running through the streets of Portland and she spots an airplane and I'm gonna do that. And her mother says, no, no, you're not. And I feel like that doesn't only just speak to the societal expectations of women. Would you say that that would also be the expectations of her ethnicity as well?
I think some of it, I think most of that scene at that time, which would have been about 1920, was more about women. Her mother said,
Mm.
the boys and certainly don't beat them. Hazel was always running and racing the boys. The girls wouldn't dare race, but she would, and she won. And her mother said, "Stop it! Don't, girls don't
Girls don't race boys. She
do
wanted
they?"
to be a little lady and she just,
And on
But
top of that, if you do race them, let your brothers win.
exactly.
yeah, always let.
Always let your brothers win. That speaks to, I think that speaks to a lot of different, that speaks to a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different families. I mean, but
Yeah.
um, did you have any contact with her family in your research? Because I know you kind of speak of how after she passed, her family made this pact never to speak of her again. But I mean, and that broke my heart because, oh my God, how do you just cease? First of all, how do you just cease speaking of somebody that you loved for so long, that was your blood? And second of all, of such a bright, like a bright part of your life, why would you want to dim that light? I mean, I firmly believe that people truly die when we stop speaking about them.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, a lot of stories about her did die because of that. And the only family members that were still alive were nieces and nephews
Mhm.
who had known her and actually knew very little about her. The stories I told were things they'd never heard because no one ever talked about her. And they did that partly to not upset their mother, who of course lost a son and a daughter within a week of each other in the
Right.
Yeah.
and it upset her. But and that was a little bit the culture, but also it was a time in this country, in the United States, where people didn't dwell on sad things, and in order to keep going, they didn't. I mean, they would remember them and talk about them sometimes, but not like we do now. There wasn't an awareness of how important that is
Yeah.
to talk
Yeah.
about sad things.
I feel like especially post-war as well, where the world has just gone through this traumatic
Mhm.
event of so many years, they wouldn't want to dwell upon it.
Yeah.
We know Hazel was married, and we know that Cliff ultimately survived the war. Did he ever speak of Hazel again, or I don't remember if he got remarried?
He did get remarried and had children. And all I found out from the family and also from some Chinese community members here in Portland was that there was some kind of riff, something between Cliff and the family after Hazel had died
Right.
that not speak to each other. And the thought was that the family was upset that he remarried. But the thing is, he stayed single for a year and pretty much lived as a hermit after her death. So he became a recluse. And then eventually he, reemerged. He's in the Chinese Air Force. I believe he's a general at that time. And he remarries and has children. And I think he's gone now, but up until not that long ago, he was living somewhere in Asia, not China,
Wow.
say maybe South Korea or something like that. So he did live a long life, and I don't know that he talked about her. I don't know that he told his family, his children, about her.
I think,
Wow.
and Winnie and I, we say this all the time, that during that time, it was, I think, expected of men to remarry,
Yeah.
and women could kind of forge their own way in the sense that they would be able to survive if their
Right.
husband passed away. I mean, I know my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, her husband served in the war. My grandfather served in the war, and he died young. He died in 1966. He was pretty young. And some of her sisters said, you have 4 kids, you should get remarried. And she's, no, I'm okay.
I want to do that.
But I think if it had been the opposite, my grandfather would have had to remarry. I don't know that he would have been able to handle that. Not to say he wasn't a
Yeah.
strong individual. I just think that people expected women to be able to pick up and move on and take care of the kids, and men needed a caregiver in a way.
Essentially.
Right. My father would have starved if my mother had died. He literally couldn't boil water, you know. Um,
Goodness.
but keep in mind that Cliff and Hazel were married in October, and she died at the end of November, and he was back in China. They only spent 2 weeks together. So even though they lived together and had really a romance for about 10 years,
Right.
they had spent very little of that time on the same continent. And so after their 2 weeks here, after their marriage in New York, he returned to China. And before the accident, Hazel told her friends that she had a very powerful feeling that he had been killed or taken prisoner because she hadn't heard from him, and that was unusual. And she just felt it. She had kind of this intuition that he had died.
I remember
Yeah.
that she had this, that they weren't ever going to see each other again, but it ended up being
In the
the
other way.
opposite way around, which broke my heart.
I will also say the helmet in her car, the motorbike helmet in her car, that broke me, especially when one of the other women pilots drove her car home and she kept the helmet where it
And
was. Oh,
Yeah.
no.
there
It
it was.
really upset me.
I try to make a point of keeping myself composed in public, but I was reading the end of the book. I was on the bus coming home from work, and
Just streaming.
oh, it had me. It
It was
really
hard.
had me.
It
I'm
was
sorry.
rough.
No, don't be.
Don't be. We loved
When
it.
a book gets me like that, I will pick it up and read it again, probably 4 or 5 more times.
We're just two very emotional young women
we're
who just
very
cry at
invested in
everything.
this, actually. No, the stories of these women have us really, really invested.
Actually, like following on from that, was Hazel your introduction to the Wasp, or was it just like a general knowledge first of all, and then you found out about Hazel?
Hazel was my introduction. I knew who
Wow.
they, Rosie the Riveters and Wasp, but I really knew very little about the Wasps. So I learned a lot from Hazel, and then of course the whole story, as you know, expands to include quite a few of the women who were women Air Force service,
Yeah,
like Hazel.
wonderful.
Um,
Um,
Go ahead.
we really enjoyed reading about her time in where she began flying in fly school with Al Greenwood. What was it that compelled him to have a Chinese only flying school?
Well, he was asked to do it, but I think even before he was asked, he was just a different kind of person that, at that time there was a lot of animosity about Chinese Americans and beliefs that were inaccurate. And he was just the kind of person that thought, well, if I teach Chinese American to fly, I can prove that they're just like anybody else and maybe better. So that was kind of a challenge to him. But he did not decide to do that by himself. He was chosen by Chinatown, the Chinese Benevolent Society in Portland, who were looking for a flying school to teach young Chinese American boys. I mean, they were, teens and early 20s. Al Greenwood would train them to fly, and then to fly open airport, combat in aircrafts, open aircraft, sorry, and go to China to fight against the invading Japanese. So that was what Al Greenwood was chosen to do. So he sort of ended up this leader of this 33 Chinese American, all young boys except for Hazel and Virginia. And all of the members, 33, were, I think, between 16 and 22, maybe.
Very young.
Very
Very-
young.
Very young.
I mean, babies by today's standards. Yeah.
By,
Did her other classmates learn of her death while they were in China? Or was it a case of they came home to the States
sorry,
and found out that way?
I didn't get the first part of
Oh,
it.
sorry. When she was in the class, obviously they all went to China afterwards. Did the people that remained in China find out about her death at the time? Or was it a case of they came home after the war to the US and then they learned?
Well, I would assume because of the time discrepancy, these Hazel went to China, as they all did, in 33, and they were there about 38 when basically
Right.
the Japanese had successfully taken
Yeah.
it. So by 38, they were either killed or they came back to the country if they could, or they were war refugees there. So
Wow.
we're still talking another 5 or 6 years before Hazel's even doing what she's doing with the wasps.
Right.
So and most of them were back in this country. Some of them, like Cliff, stayed and were officers with the Chinese Air Force. So yes, some of her death in China.
Wow.
It struck me as interesting. She was interviewed by Jackie Cochran herself to join
Yes.
the training detachment. Not every woman who was accepted was interviewed by Jackie directly. Was it just a case of, do you happen to know if it was a case of right time, they were both in New York, or was Jackie she was that taken with Hazel's? Because I know that there was, Jackie refused, and I hate even to even say it, that she refused to take African-American women to fly in the WASP program because of prejudice and racism at the time. But she took Hazel without batting an eye, but
it was risky. Yeah,
it was risky for the time. Yeah.
How they would be treated when they flew across the country.
Yeah.
Jackie Cochran had nothing against African-American women, but they would have to fly these airplanes, ferry them down to southern towns.
Right.
Makes sense.
It wouldn't be able to eat in a restaurant or
it would be dangerous for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the main reason in the beginning, and she planned to later include them. With Hazel, it was a combination of things. She was Chinese American, and at this time, this is after Pearl Harbor, we were in the war, and China was one of our allies.
Right.
The idea had completely shifted in our country about Chinese people once World War II started. And then Hazel had this incredible track record of being in China and, seeing combat. And she also had a letter from basically the president of China. His wife wrote a letter to her, and Jackie was very impressed about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, and they were able to meet, yes, because Hazel was living in New York with her sister. She was working at that time, and that's where Jackie's office was. Most of the girls received letters, all over the country, including North Dakota and, small places where Jackie wouldn't have been able to interview them in person.
Did Hazel have a favorite aircraft to fly?
I don't know which one, but definitely the fighter aircraft, the fast one.
Yeah, we're sensing a theme.
That seems to be the theme we're getting from everybody we speak to.
P-51.
That pursuits were their favorites.
The
Yeah.
pursuits were the favorites. Yeah, it seems to be that as well.
There were a group. Now there was a little bit over 1,000 women who graduated from the training and became WASPs. Of that group, 100 were given the option, as Hazel was, to fly either bombers or pursuits, fighter aircraft. And Hazel chose fighter aircraft because she wanted to go fast. That, it was an elite group that flew the bombers and the fighter aircraft.
Yeah, I've just got to that part in Wonderful Women and Their Flying Machines. I've just got past the bomber group, and now I'm with that group. They haven't mentioned Hazel just yet. I've looked in the index, and there is like a tiny small section about her, but it was in the episode we did, part 1 of The Wasp, where we described that Josie Pitts Egan would have to sit on her parachute to be able to see.
Yes.
And I'm assuming Hazel was much the same, because I think they're around the same
Around
height.
the same height, yeah.
Josie was 5'3", I think, and I think Hazel was around.
They sat on blocks or different kinds of books, and they also used blocks on their feet to reach the pedals, because most were 5'2" or 3", and
That's so.
they see their head.
Yeah.
Aircraft like the P-51.
They were fearless.
They really were.
They were fearless.
And it's just an extra surprise when the cockpit opens and there's a man waiting for another man to pop out, and out pops this little lady, like, hi. Which I think would be quite funny to witness in that time.
Well, that's like when Josie Pitts landed her pursuit, and the gentleman waiting for her on the runway said to her, "Little girl, you're on fire." And she didn't realize it first. And then the engine was on fire.
I would love to talk about the section in the book where Hazel walks back to base, or she gets a ride back to base with the
after she bails out.
Still, with
and
the
she's got her ring,
out.
her parachute ring.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, she was walking back. She's like, I'm fine.
With no shoes on.
With no shoes on.
No shoes on.
With no shoes on.
It tickled me.
Yes.
So Hazel. And what happened was, when they became inverted, she was with her instructor, and he was teaching her. It was fairly early in her training, teaching her to do inversions. Somehow, probably her seatbelt had not been completely latched.
Mm-hmm.
When they went inverted, she fell out of the airplane, and luckily had a parachute, and first time she'd ever used it. Of course, she was dragged along the dirt. It was very dry and rough ground. Lost her shoes, all scratched up, but she had her D-ring from the parachute to prove that she'd be in the Caterpillar Club now. That's anyone who's parachuted out of an airplane. And she's heading back like 5 miles to the base, but they did come and find her. They came in the Jeep and picked her up. And
that's good. I'm glad she didn't have to walk the whole thing with no shoes in Texas.
I feel like it is very her that she was waving her D-ring as like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
I made it. I'm here. And she was ready to get back in a plane and keep going.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like nothing stopped her. Like, I just feel like, get the feeling about her that nothing stopped her. She wouldn't and if it did, she wouldn't let it.
Right. Just kept going.
Yeah.
Always.
They just seemed like it was almost like a sorority.
Yes.
The girls, they would haze the new girls and throw them in the fountain, but they would still like take care of them in a way.
Yeah, they would. And you know, they were a very particular group of women, having so much in common. And many of them had never known women before who knew how to fly. I mean, there were only a couple thousand women with license states. So now they're all together. So it was really like women going to college or a specialty school for the first time.
Yeah.
They loved it, but it was grueling. It was absolutely grueling.
Hours and hours a day flying and training.
And in that heat.
No air conditioning.
No air conditioning at the time. And even you said the barracks had no cross breeze.
Right.
So they would take their cots outside and wrap the blankets real tight to keep the bugs out, and they would sleep outside.
The scorpions and the snakes. The capital of the world is Sweetwater, Texas. So
oh god,
I am a city girl through and through.
Say that I just moved here from New Mexico, so I've had my fair share of sandy bugs and horrible yuckies. It's moth season in New Mexico right now. and in our old house we had a big bay window, so the moths would just come in and just be attracted.
Oh,
So I understood when you described the bugs and everything else in Texas. I was like, because I was right over the border from Lubbock.
okay.
Um, so
Big,
yeah, I've seen my fair share of big
and
big buggies.
some of the women were from New York City. They were from all over. So I'm sure
Yeah.
Rockette, that was a big shock for. Well, in
Oh
Portland,
yeah.
Hazel too.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. How long did the book take you to write? Was it a case of dedicating years to it, or did it all just sort of fly out
Uh,
literally onto the onto the page?
8 months because I signed a contract that I would write it in 8 months.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay.
Smart.
Book in 8 months? Well, you can, but that's pretty much all I did for 8 months. So I researched for pretty much 3 solid months and then wrote for 6. And of course, then when I turn it in, it still goes for a year through editing and fact checking.
Hmm.
All kinds of editors read it, but my rough draft had to be turned in 8 months. So it was intense, and that's all I did. But also, it really kept me in the story. You know,
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't lose track of what was going on, or did I already say that in another chapter, because I was doing it all the time and I wasn't doing anything else. So
I think we feel like that in a way, Gabby, where we're dedicating so much time to this that it's sort of like we're not losing, even though it's only, part-time for us right now. It's
Yeah,
sort
I
of
think
like we're not losing track of.
we went into it with the intention of giving, and we obviously still do keep the intention of giving equal attention to all the different women and the divisions and the jobs that they held during the war. And I think in the back of my head, I was like, oh, I was like, oh, well, we're named after the Donut Dollies. We're named after the Red Cross girls. We'll give the Red Cross girls, a little extra love. I did not expect the WASP to take such a hold
We're
and
so invested in this.
really pull me in. I remember we were just talking about this the other day. It's at the very end of Masters of the Air where they give you the overview and they say that John Egan's wife was a WASP. And
We
I
kind of
said,
shrugged it
oh,
off initially. We were
I said,
like,
oh,
oh,
that's
that's
really cool. She
nice.
served, she served too.
Yeah.
Not realizing at the time that they weren't even militarized, that they had not only spent the entire time of the war doing this job that really should have been a job for the military, but also fighting for that acceptance and that spot among the people who were fighting that they didn't get for like 35, 36 years after. There
right,
was a long stretch of time between the end of their this disbandment in 44, which I mean Hazel passed right before the WASP were disbanded,
oh,
and then it's 1977. Did you I know you talk about it a little bit at the end that the WASP were, recognized in 77. Did you do any deep research into that, or was it just kind of a general, just need to know basis on their veteran status post-war?
well, I mean, yes and no. I
Mhm.
definitely talk about it in the last chapter of the book. And then, of course, they went on to be awarded the Medal of Honor by Barack Obama. And there were, I think, 6 of them present. And I can't remember the date that was, but Barack Obama was president who awarded that. But yeah, it was decades after the WASPs were disbanded before they were permitted in the military again as pilots. Decades. So I do think that what they did laid the groundwork for that. I think that
Right.
their contribution was extremely significant. But like you said, they were not in the military. They were volunteers, and they were not privileged to have any of the privileges that the male cadets did, who were doing the exact same work. They went through the same training as the male cadets, which basically was an aeronautical degree by the time they finished their WASP training. And when they got out, they there was nothing they could do. Nobody wanted a woman to fly an airplane, commercial.
Right.
So very few of them ever flew again after the very abrupt disbandment in December.
Yeah.
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 Having
Yeah.
to find their own way home right before Christmas, which
Now a few
diabolical.
cases helped the girls get home,
Oh,
but
that's
many
good.
did not. Yeah. And I know you talk about that in your last interview, how like not all men were terrible. I mean, a lot of men
Yeah.
Wasps were flying planes, very supportive. The cadets that learned with them were, just very supportive and understood the women were doing the same thing. So some of the bases helped the women get home, but I would say most of the women, 4 days before Christmas, were just stranded. Get home however you can.
Right.
Wow.
There was a document. We were fortunate enough to get a copy of Hazel's documents from the war through the St. Louis archive. And there's a letter that was mailed to her sister after her death that was from Hap Arnold. But essentially, the letter itself stated that, Hazel was part of the Air Force family, and if they would be part of her sisters and her family would be part of the Air Force family in her, death. It struck me as very odd and almost kind of like backhanded, because they weren't part of the Air Force, and he was just kind of saying it to say it. Hap Arnold, I mean, he championed for them with Jackie Cochran, but at the end, he kind of gave up the fight, so to speak.
Well, yeah, and it was basically a very political decision. Congress decided to not award them or admit them into the military at the end. And so Hap Arnold really wanted them in the military.
There's a letter in her documents to her sister Bowen Chan. And it's a letter that says, "Dear Mrs. Chan, during the Army Air Force's tribute to the women Air Force service pilots at Sweetwater, Texas, on the 7th of December, a plaque was dedicated to the memory of those WASP who died while serving their country. The plaque will be on display in this headquarters until such time as there is established a permanent collection commemorating the Air Force's part in this war. Realizing that you may not have an opportunity to see the plaque and knowing that you would treasure such a memorial to your sister, I'm including a photographic copy of it. You will also receive shortly the certificate of service and the service pin earned by your sister. In accepting them for her, I hope that you will always feel that you are yourself a member of the Air Force's family. Very sincerely, H.H. Arnold." And it's dated 1945. So it's right after, it's 12th of January, 45. So it's right after the disbandment.
That was the most he could do.
Which is so sad.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
It is. I love that his son picked up the fight, though. That was always it sat well with me. One of those things where I was like, oh, good.
He didn't have to do that, and that was incredible.
Yeah.
No, he didn't.
True.
And
his dad, General Arnold was very supportive of the WASPs and did as much and more than he could. He got made fun of essentially a lot that he was having like an affair with Jackie Cochran. He was called her champion.
Yes, I remember reading that. Yes.
Yeah.
Believed in it, and it's very unfortunate that he and Jackie both felt like the program failed, which of course ultimately it did not, but at the time
it felt like a failure.
Yeah.
Do you think that if Hazel had survived and carried on, do you think she would have flown after the war? Because I feel like it was so much in her blood and in her being to fly. Do you think she would have carried on flying, or do you think she would have joined the many other WASP that essentially stopped flying post-war?
No, she had made plans. In November, it looked like they were likely going to be disbanded, even though it happened very quickly. Maybe they didn't think it was going to happen that quickly. The American people had turned against them, and they knew they were going to be sent home, and they knew why. They knew what the sentiment was. Hazel had made arrangements. Her husband is still in China to become a pilot over there on something that was called the Hump through the Himalayas, because Japan cut off all supply routes to China. But through the Himalayas, there was this very dangerous, steep canyon. They called it the Hump, littered with planes that didn't make it. And she would have very likely been the first woman to fly that. And she had even recruited some other WASPs who were also interested in going. And she was making arrangements to do that when she died. And I think she would have. And I think she would have been the first woman. Instead, Nancy Love became the first woman to fly the Hump.
She did.
Yeah.
She was, yeah.
Very appropriately. I'm glad that it was a WASP that was the first woman to fly that route. I
too.
really am. And I'm glad in a way that it was Nancy.
Yes.
I'm sure
Also,
I'm sure Jackie would
Jackie
have,
was not.
and I'm also sure Jackie was not happy about it, but I just feel like Nancy's approach to the war and the women flying with them was more subdued. You know, she
More
took a
sensible,
more
I would say.
yes, a more sensible approach, less in your face, less not to say that Jackie was waving dollar bills to get what she wanted, but also she paid for their uniforms and she paid for their wings, and you know.
Well, and Nancy's girls didn't need money. Her girls, and I think she had 25 before Jackie started her program of additional women. They were all women from wealthy families, including.
Right.
And so that created a big difference and animosity, really, right from the beginning. They were two distinct groups, and Nancy got a lot of respect for being, you know, from a wealthy family. Her husband was military.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, and Jackie was ruthless.
That's a good word to describe her.
That
Is
is very
ruthless.
ruthless. Absolutely.
Yeah, because
do whatever had to be done.
yeah, she did. And I mean, we said it earlier this morning when we were talking, Winnie, that oh, there goes my thought.
Happens to me all the time. Happened
Yeah.
to me this
Oh,
morning.
there goes my thought.
It's like falls out of my ears.
There it is.
There
Okay.
we go.
That we said it this morning that even though Jackie married into money and then she would somehow be in the same social circles as Nancy, people tolerated her, but they didn't particularly care for her.
Right.
And it was not really a way of the times to voice your distaste so publicly of somebody. So they just kind of tolerated her.
Yeah,
But
she was new money.
new money. That's exactly it.
There it is.
Yeah, she didn't have the graces that these Nancy and her girls did.
Right.
You know, so
Absolutely.
in a way, it was much harder for Jackie. Jackie had a lot more to fight against, and Jackie saw Hazel as a person like herself, a person who hadn't been handed anything, but who'd had to fight for everything. And so,
Right.
if Jackie was ruthless and Nancy wasn't, there was some reason for that in how their lives had been played out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scrappy's a good word for them for
Yeah.
Jackie. Yeah.
Definitely.
Definitely. You good?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going through just checking our questions real quick. I'm make sure we
Yes.
don't miss anything.
I don't think we have.
I did have one other question, and it's so funny, Winnie, it's the first question on our list.
Skipped it.
We did skip it because we just jumped right into talking about Hazel, but you were a teacher before you became a writer.
Yes, I was.
And you left teaching because you began researching your father's service. What was it that really compelled you to, like, what really compelled you to do that? I mean, were you teaching history at the time, or were you teaching something else?
No, I was teaching something else, and I never wanted to write my dad's story. I wanted him to do it, and because he was always telling it. I knew it, and you know, he would go and talk to different groups about it. So he had all these notes, and I was always trying to get him to write it down like in a chronological order, because that's of course not how World War II stories are told. And he passed away, and there was all of this writing, and then there were all these letters from French resistance members who had saved his life, and they invited me to France, and I was taken along his path, and I met the people who had hidden him and saw the he was hidden. And that's when I thought, this is a book that I want to tell the story of these French people who would have been killed, and there were children in the homes. They all would have died for helping my dad and other US and British and Canadian airmen get back home. They sacrificed everything for these men. So that's the first book, and I did not intend to write it originally, but I'm glad I did, and I certainly learned a lot more about my dad's story and what happened to him, and those incredible people.
Mhm.
It was
It's
a
definitely on our list to read. I think it's on our little shared wish list. So we're
Yeah.
really excited to get around to it.
Yes. And we're also going to
read
be
it.
covering the people who did help the down airmen escape as well, because their story is definitely one to be told.
Hey, maybe come back for that one too.
Yeah.
it's another untold story like Hazel. There's
There
so
we go. See, so much to cover.
That's what we feel like we're uncovering, is that there's just, you turn one stone over and there's three more underneath it that you have to
Yeah.
turn over, and everything just kind of bleeds into each other, because the war
Absolutely.
really is one comprehensive story, but there's so many little stories that make it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And women were there.
And women were there,
They
and
were
that's the
definitely
important thing.
there.
Women were there. A
Seem to
lot of
forget that
people,
part.
I know, a lot of people just put them in the category of, well, they were Rosies or they were nurses,
Yeah.
or they
Secretary.
served coffee and donuts off the back of a truck,
Yeah.
which we didn't even know that there was a clubmobile service prior to, really digging. We just assumed that the Red Cross was nurses,
Medical help and
medical
stuff.
help,
Yeah.
supplies overseas, and nurses.
Yeah.
So that's what it's been, is a learning experience.
Mhm.
And learning about Hazel as
Oh
well
my
has
God.
been such a pleasure. Every time I go to the Museum of Flight here in Seattle, I see a little picture of Hazel. I'm like, hey girl,
Hey, girl.
nice to see you.
It is. She definitely felt like a friend by the end of the book.
Yeah, that's it. I feel so close to her now that it was to a point where the last time I went to the museum, there was a section for Women's History Month in the gift shop, and all of them were tucked in facing a certain way. And I ended up telling someone that works in the gift shop, I said, excuse me, my girl should not be tucked in this corner. Can you pull them back out, please?
Good for
And
you.
they did it. They did it. They moved
I
it
love
forward.
that.
And I was
Oh.
like, can you put Fly Girl at the front? Because that's my favorite. Thank you so much. And they did. I was like, great. Perfect. It was just shoved. And I'm like, get them out. They don't like it in there.
Corner.
They shouldn't be in there.
That's
No,
right.
they deserve, you're 100% right. They deserve to be just as celebrated as the men who dropped bombs and lived in foxholes, and they did their share. They got their hands dirty.
And it doesn't take
Absolutely.
anything away from the men to
It
bring out.
doesn't.
Right.
It
Not
really
one
doesn't.
bit.
At the time, men felt like it was.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And you look back on it, and really all they were a helping. They were a helping hand.
Yeah.
They saw what needed to be done. They didn't hesitate, and I love that so much.
Oh.
And I think with that, we're going to say thank you, Susan, so much for talking to us today and for sharing your knowledge of Hazel with us, because for all we knew, you just amplified it times 10.
It's been wonderful. It's
Yeah.
honestly, every single time we do one of these, I feel so honored and privileged that not only we get to tell the stories, but we also get to share it with the people that started the research themselves. So thank you so much.
You for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. That's so sweet.
Yes, thank you.
Oh.
For anybody who hasn't read American Fly Girl, you can pick it up at your local bookstore. You can get it on Amazon. And Susan, where can people find you?
My website is susantateankeny.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Susan Tate Ankeny.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank
So
you
guys,
so
make sure
much
you give
again.
Susan a follow, and please read American Fly Girl. That's
Read
all
the
I'm going to
book.
say. And I'm not just saying that because Susan is
She's
here.
here.
Please read it. It was a beautiful book, and Hazel's story
It's
is
wonderful.
beautiful. So
Mm.
thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.